Bernie Sanders and Mayor Buttigieg, but it looked like a huge embarrassment for the Democratic Party. For those of us who live in Florida, remember the Chads, and remember some other instances that were pretty confusing when Governor DeSantis beat Mayor Gillum for the governorship last year, and Bill Nelson and Rick Scott were neck and neck, and there were recounts. This was just silly, and it shouldn't happen. And if you're going to use an innovative app, make sure that it passes certain quality control tests, which it didn't. But it's not unusual. In 2012, Mitt Romney was declared the winner of Iowa, and 16 days later, after Romney carried that momentum through New Hampshire, Rick Santorum was retroactively declared the winner in Iowa, but didn't help him very much. So if you look at the Democratic landscape, you had 5 people getting meaningful numbers of votes. Right? There were 2 other people on the ballot, Andrew Yang and Tom Steyer. They didn't really get any votes. I think collectively everybody else got maybe 1.5%. But the five candidates who got meaningful votes, double-digit votes, were, as I mentioned, Senator Bernie Sanders, who is a heavy favorite for what seems to be a long primary contest. Mayor Buttigieg. Third was Senator Elizabeth Warren, former Vice President Joe Biden, and Senator Amy Klobuchar from next door in Minnesota. So let's go from bottom to top. Even though Iowa is a small state, it's not very representative. We're going to have the New Hampshire primary early next week. If you want, we could talk serially how I think things look. If you were here, if any of you were here 2 weeks ago, we had Mike Bloomberg, who's definitely a factor that I'll talk a lot about today. But he was one of the big winners of the debacle of what they call the Chaos Caucus in Iowa, because it just proved to be not serious. And his argument, to the detriment of, or actually to the disdain of the other Democratic candidates who held 2,200 events and spent hundreds of millions of dollars just on that state, Iowa became a non-event. So he was a big winner, and the bigger winner was the other fellow who didn't participate in the Democratic caucus, and that's President Trump, who just can point a finger at the Democratic Party and say, how much egg on your face are you willing to have just in 1 week? So it played very much into his hands. The 2 winners, Sanders and Buttigieg, got a little bit of a momentum boost. Biden was the big loser. I mean, the fact that the numbers didn't really play out till later on may have mitigated the loss a little bit, because there was nobody who was able to sort of raise a flag and say, I won, and though it seems like everybody did. Conan O'Brien made a joke about that. The Oscars are going to be next week, and everybody gets to win, and then weeks later we'll find out who really did, but at least everybody gets to make an acceptance speech. Amy Klobuchar, who got about 12% of the delegates, she's well known to the U.S.-Israel community. She's well known in Minnesota. She's not Jewish, but she's been a good friend of the community. She's gotten criticized on the right because she's spoken at J Street events. Separately, we could talk maybe I'll save that for the last class after the APAC policy conference. J Street seems to be a bellwether for folks who are trying to gauge whether or not somebody's support for Israel is sincere. And if you're willing to accept an endorsement from J Street, or even speak at one of their events, and certainly at their annual conference, it's a stigma. It's a badge of shame, and it excludes you from support from the mainstream Jewish community. I personally, that's not my belief, but a lot of people feel that way, and I co-chair a PAC that does write checks to pro-Israel. I'm not a member of J Street. I do participate actively in APAC events, but I'm not sure that it's in the community's best interest to just, paint a scarlet letter on any American politician who has any affiliation or sits in the same room with J Street whatsoever. On balance, she's fine. She's sort of a well-known, well-tested, pro-Israel supporter, votes consistently in the Senate for issues that are important to the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I can go on and on and on, but she has no chance of winning. So we'll jump to Senator Warren. Senator Warren looked like she was just on fire. She seemed to be able to do nothing wrong, even, the president's lamentable Pocahontas comments because she's 1/32nd Indian or whatever. I mean, the funnier line that I heard on that is, funny she doesn't look Suish. But but regardless of what she looks like, she was an extremely effective politician. She was slated to run the Consumer Protection Bureau that was set up during the Obama administration. They wouldn't confirm her in the Senate, so she wound up running against Scott Brown, who got Ted Kennedy's Senate seat in a special election in 2010, which was, as you may remember, a sweeping year for Republicans. In 2012, during a presidential election year, he lost that seat to Senator Warren, and she's been a very vocal presence in the United States Senate, and she has veered further and further to the left. She actually began her career as she didn't go to the University of Chicago, but a law and economics, University of Chicago style Republican, a registered Republican until the mid-90s, and she switched. And I don't even know if she remembers those days. She's not a kid, she's 70 years old. If we had this conversation a month ago, I would say she'd be heavily favored to eclipse Bernie Sanders as the standard bearer of the progressive left. It's interesting that the two most progressive, most adored members of the progressive fringe of the Democratic Party are septuagenarians. They're both over 70, so there's hope for the rest of us in this room. But she started losing ground, and she tried to be too many things to too many people. She issued dozens, if not more, policy papers that in some cases contradicted each other. She got a little over her skis on healthcare and free education for everybody, and then she actually had a little spat with Sanders that I thought was interesting. Like, I wouldn't really support either one of them, but I wondered when they would start to fight each other, because they're clearly trying to capture the same slice of pie. And it started before the previous debate, when she accused him of having told her, or having someone on his staff say, that a woman can never win, and he fought back. And it seems like since that break, he's done a little better and she's done a little worse. It's still early stages. There are 49 states left to go. She could gain momentum, he could lose momentum, but as it stands right now, especially given the next states are good ones for Bernie Sanders. New Hampshire, obviously right next door to his home state of Vermont. South Carolina, Nevada, he performed well in South Carolina in 2016. Super Tuesday, he's got the most money, ex-Bloomberg obviously, of all the Democrats who are actually getting money from other candidates. Sanders has the most, so we'll get to him in a second. I skipped over Joe Biden, sorry. So Warren finished third. She could win. I don't think she will. She has, again, tried to be the darling of the progressive left in the Democratic Party, and therefore, alongside some of her colleagues, has made statements that people in the pro-Israel community would deem unfortunate, probably most relevant, conditioning future aid to Israel on good behavior, so that the $4 billion in annual aid for military assistance would now be indexed to some sort of menu of milestones, or behaving in a way that the U.S. government or her administration would deem acceptable. Sanders has been even more vocal. She's called Prime Minister Netanyahu a racist. He's condemned the Israeli government for ignoring the plight of the Palestinians. Sanders is, of the leading candidates, the most vociferous. Mayor Buttigieg was a little bit equivocal when asked the same question, but he actually participated in a very important initiative run under the umbrella of the ATJC. It's called Project Interchange. I actually personally had a role in that, not in his trip, but it's a group that takes centers of influence, so be presidents of universities and colleges, Rhodes Scholars. He would have qualified for that too, but he went on a mayor's trip, and it's transformational. I mean, from this community, Mayor Carlos Jimenez went on the mayor's trip. I don't think he was on the same trip as Mayor Buttigieg, but I'll check. Donna Shalala, now a congresswoman, but then the president of the University of Miami went. We had the heads of Homeland Security for both the City of Miami and Miami-Dade County Police Departments. So we've actually had some pretty interesting representation here as well. And without, it's kind of like birthright, but for people who actually have jobs and are much more advanced in their careers, and there's a lot of peer learning that takes place. So the presidents of universities and colleges intermingle with presidents of Israeli universities and colleges, similar to the mayors of cities or journalists, and what have you. So he came back empowered. He said a lot of positive things about Israel. I'm not worried about where, what a Buttigieg administration would look like. I'm pretty certain that he's not going to win either. I mean, he spent a lot of his money in Iowa. He proved that he finished first by very little, but nobody 6 months ago would have given him any chance. Joe Biden was the big loser because he's still the front runner if you look nationwide. He was vice president under a very popular Democratic president for 8 years. He certainly has not wasted any time in grabbing the cloak of Obama and enveloping himself in it, because he feels that a lot was accomplished under that presidency. And in 2016, he would have liked very much. I mean, this is not a person who is, unambitious, right? I mean, he got to the Senate early in life. He had personal tragedy early in life, got remarried. He lost his son in 2015, which was one of the reasons why he didn't win in 2016. But the other reason was that Hillary Clinton was the heir apparent. She was crowned as the new president of the United States, and it was pretty clear to everybody, certainly in her milieu, that was going to happen. And I think Trump himself was surprised that he won the election when he won it. But it would have been very difficult for a Biden, and it would have been very difficult then for a Bloomberg to carve out space for themselves after Hillary was so protective, and the Clinton brand was still very powerful within the Democratic Party. Now it's got zero brand value whatsoever. But that was not the case in 2014, 15, certainly 2016, when the vice president decided to wait. This time, obviously, we know what happened in 2016, so there was very little doubt that he was going to run. He waited a while to announce. Since announcing, he's always had this lead over the other candidates. It's not precarious in percentage points. It's never been, no one's ever been within 5 percentage points of him on a national poll. That's going to change now that there are many fewer candidates. I mean, at some point there were 20 people in this race. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are only half a dozen that are polling seriously. Biden is fine on, you might say, well, Obama was horrible and he's associated with Obama and he'd follow the Obama policies. And maybe I'm only looking at this through a prism of the other people who are contending for the nomination in the Democratic Party. But Biden was always the person who would be sent out to the pro-Israel community when there was tension with the administration. So if President Obama said things that folks felt were uncomfortable, Vice President Biden would often, including at policy conference, be the one who was tasked with unruffling some of those feathers. But at the end of the day, he was the vice president. So he really, even during, Kerry's shuttling back and forth, when it seemed like there was undue pressure being applied to the Israelis, Vice President Biden was on a tour of, major American Jewish groups here in the United States, saying, well, nobody's going to be pushed into any positioning, and obviously this is something that has to be negotiated between the parties. And when his competitors or colleagues running for the nomination said things like conditioning aid on Israeli conduct, Biden was extremely quick to announce that that's not the way he sees the world whatsoever. He's very very much in favor of that assistance and believes that it serves America's national security interests, and it shouldn't be used as a prod to nudge any Israeli administration to behaving one way or the other. So we'll see what happens. Like I said, it's still very early days. Sanders is worrisome to me. Linda Sarsour, who I talked about J Street, and you don't necessarily want to exclude anybody who's been in a room with somebody that you don't like. And I don't like J Street at all. I think that they're a hoax. I've written articles about this going back as early as 2009. So there should be no misunderstanding in this room. I'm not saying anything positive about J Street. I'm just wondering out loud whether somebody else who has a connection to J Street or participate in a J Street event should be blacklisted or excluded as a potential ally in this very important relationship. And I think that that's a conclusion that we draw at our peril. I mean, I'm reminded of a story about a fellow who goes to Spain to watch a bullfight. And at the end of the fight, he goes to a restaurant, takes a menu, orders a salad, eating a salad, and then the guy next to him gets this giant plate with these 2 steaming balls. And the guy goes to the maitre d', he goes, "What is that?" I say, "Senor, it's the special of the day. After the bullfight, we take that." Great. Next year, goes back to Spain, watches the fight, comes to the restaurant. "I don't need a menu. I want the special of the day." He gets a plate, these 2 little shriveled balls. Calls the maitre d', "I was here last year." "Senor, the bull does not always lose." So this brings us, I'm going to get to Trump in a second. This brings us to Bloomberg. So Bloomberg is kind of like somebody that, if most of my fellow travelers and I were sitting in a room trying to come up with a guy who could be a good president and not be affected by money, certainly wealthy enough to not be induced or seduced by special interests, who has executive experience both in the private sector and the public sector, very successful executive experience. He was actually pretty successful at Salomon Brothers. He lost a political fight. It was still a partnership. He got $10 million of severance, which was a lot of money on Wall Street at the time. He started a company, and he's now worth close to $60 billion. He ran as mayor of New York as a Republican. On September 10th, 2001, he would have had no chance of winning. And, then 9/11 happened, and Rudy Giuliani, who, again, on September 10th, 2001, was term limited, but he couldn't get elected dog catcher in New York. He was not popular towards the end of his second term for all sorts of things that make, Bloomberg's stop and frisk seem like child's play. But he was a good mayor, and he actually convinced people to allow him to run for a 3rd term. There was no New York Constitution that says you can't run, but there was clearly a tradition that you don't run for a 3rd term. And he agitated to reverse that tradition, and they enabled him to do that because he was a very effective mayor, and New York did extremely well. Giuliani instituted some policies that paved the way for people feeling safer in New York and drawing capital back into the city. And Bloomberg just built on some of those initiatives and launched many more of his own. And he was good, and he's also not an unambitious person. He would have loved to have been president, but there wasn't a path to the presidency for him till now. And he waited a long time. But if you think about how he built his empire, the reason he's so wealthy is because his company is built on communication and data. They collect data. They started with these terminals that enable traders to see what's going on in the rest of the world, in every currency, in every bond, in every stock, in all sorts of derivatives and other structured products, and assembling very complex information extremely quickly. And obviously had other people working for him. Bloomberg wasn't the programmer for all these algorithms, but he clearly understands data. And if he made a decision not to run in the past, it wasn't because he had this, visceral affection for Hillary Clinton, or he just didn't think he could win. People thought he's wealthy enough to run as an independent. Yeah, he's wealthy enough to run any way he wants, but he knew that the party system in the United States would not enable an independent to win. And people in the past, Ross Perot, John Anderson, Teddy Roosevelt, have proven that. And he felt that like Ross Perot in '92 that enabled Bill Clinton to get elected, or Ralph Nader in 2000 that enabled George Bush, the son, to get elected, his foray into the race would just siphon votes away from people who just couldn't vote for Hillary Clinton as hard as they held their nose with both hands, and therefore enable Donald Trump to become president, which would be anathema, impossible, and happened without his being in the race. So now he really felt that this was an opportunity, and when he saw the confusion within the Democratic Party, I think he felt that it created an opening. And the way the system works, Bloomberg can not win any single state. He's competing in 46 out of 50, so that's a lot. But he cannot win any single state and still win the nomination. Because unlike sort of Canada, where it's like first past the post, right? And that's true in the Electoral College too. Now, there are a couple of states that are proportional, but I think 47 to 48 states, if you win 51% or 50.1% of the voters in that state, you get all the Electoral College votes. That's not true in the primary process. The primary process is proportional. So if there are 20 delegates to go around from any state, and you get a quarter of the vote, you get 5 delegates. So that's something that Bloomberg is relying upon. Bloomberg is relying upon being number 2 or number 3 in many states, particularly the key big states of Super Tuesday, where if it's a very progressive state, he'll be number 2 behind a Bernie Sanders. If it's a relatively moderate state, he'd be a number 2 behind Joe Biden. But he'd be number 2 enough times, or number 3 enough times, that in the aggregate, as things get closer and closer to the convention in the summertime, he will have more delegates than any other candidate. And I think that if you're watching his commercials, and if you live in Florida, it's very hard not to see his commercials. They're divided. They're divided into, we need to defeat President Trump, and divided into, I've been pretty effective as what I've done in the past, and therefore there's reason to expect that I'll be able to bring this competence and accomplishment to my next adventure. So again, it's too early to tell. I'm not here to handicap the outcome of the Democratic primary process. I am, and I'll answer more questions in Q&A, I don't really know any of these candidates personally. I met Bloomberg a couple times when, at the meet and greet when he was mayor of New York, and he'd have an event for the Jewish community. Biden once or twice at again, very large scale events. But I follow what they say and I follow what they do. Some are better than others, and what we've learned in the past, there's a very big difference between campaigning and governing. But when you've got a guy like Bernie Sanders, who's, again, endorsed by Ilhan Omar. Amy Klobuchar did not want her endorsement, and he said that she's not sure that, and she's from Minnesota. Ilhan Omar's from Minnesota, so is Senator Klobuchar, and when asked, she said, I'm not sure I'd want her to speak at the convention if I'm the nominee. I don't think she's gonna have to worry about that. But Bernie Sanders is very happy to accept her and AOC and others into his tent and have Linda Sarsour as his surrogate. So when Bloomberg was here a couple of weeks ago, he said, I'm not the only Jewish person running for president, but I'm the only one who doesn't want to turn this country into a kibbutz. So let's go over to the Republican side. There's no confusion about who's going to be the Republican nominee. It's going to be President Trump. And President Trump spoke at the 2016 APAC Policy Conference, and he said that he's going to move the capital he's going to move the embassy to the capital in Jerusalem. He's going to rip up the Iran deal. He's going to, I don't know if he specifically talked about recognizing Israeli sovereignty on the Golan Heights. And it sounded like a lot of Me Tooism because other candidates came forward and said the same thing. And then he got elected president, which nobody thought would happen, and he went ahead and did those things. So if you're looking at his presidency through the prism of the Israeli population, this is a man who delivered on his promises. And he did it in the face of a lot of resistance, a lot of counterpressure from people. I mean, he was at the IAC conference here at the beginning of December, and he was quite funny about it. I mean, it was live stand-up. I know there were some other people in the room who were there, and he said, I knew I was going to get phone calls from all these other leaders. Don't do it, don't move the embassy. There's going to be chaos, there's going to be violence. And they were all calling me, but I didn't return their calls till afterwards. Oh, what's up? And then they had nothing to say because none of these horrible predictions came true. He certainly played that audience very well. It was in Israel. The IAC is the Israel-American Council. For the past couple of years, they've had their annual conferences here. You don't have to be Israeli to attend, but they're going to have it for a third time in a row here at the Diplomat Hotel this December. If your travels bring you to Florida early enough next year, you should mark your calendar. It's smaller, more intimate, and less expensive to attend an APAC policy conference. They're different, but they're not completely different. And as you can see, certainly this year, the IAC was able to attract the President of the United States. Vice President Pence spoke last year. So there's never been a better personal relationship between any U.S. president and any Israeli prime minister. I've spoken here before so there have been 12 prime ministers of Israel and 13 presidents now since 1948. And there were some good relationships. Nixon and Golda Meir had a decent relationship. Rabin and Clinton had a very good relationship. Barack and Clinton had a decent relationship. He wasn't prime minister for that long. Ditto Olmert and George Bush. They had a pretty good relationship. Olmert, I don't know if you saw this, but he's planning to go to the UN on Tuesday and protest with Mahmoud Abbas against this. It's pathetic. I mean, I'm not supposed to voice my personal opinions here, but I just did. You'll cut me some slack on that one. He wrote a book after he got out of prison, Beguf Rishon, in the first person, which he tries to basically depict all of his malfeasance as a conspiracy theory to remove him from the prime minister's office because he was about to do a deal with the Palestinians. What he learned, and we're learning, is that the Palestinians are not interested in doing a deal. So what I said last week is that there is a laudable consistency, if you think that consistency in and of itself is a virtue, to their rejectionism. And they rejected really good deals, way better deals than they got last week, or they were offered last week. 37 following the Peel Commission. It was almost the reverse of what Trump proposed in terms of, and we'll talk about the Trump proposal in greater detail in a second. 47, 49, 67, 2000. 2000 you had the Clinton parameters. 2008 you had the Annapolis Accords and the Olmert offer. 2014 you had the Kerry principles and none of that worked. None of that worked. And certainly in 2000 and 2008 where there were tangible offers on the table that have been they weren't leaked at the time, but they've been revealed since, and they've been dissected with maps and territories and swaps. The Palestinians would have gotten anywhere between 95 to 100% of the territory of what are called the Green Line, it's really a 1949 armistice line, but they're called the 67 borders. They were never a border. But that has always formed the basis of any potential agreement between Israel and the Arabs. And that's kind of been thrown out the window. What we saw last week was a plan that, for the very first time, it's interesting because one of the I've actually leafed through. I didn't read every word and every page, but I leafed through a whole 180 pages. I'm familiar with the material, so it's it goes quickly. But the introductory comment says that we feel that it's necessary to move beyond any of the historical narratives. So whatever was said, whatever was done, failed. Why get stuck in a quagmire of failure? Move forward, move on, we're moving on. But it provides a narrative that's very close to a pro-Israel narrative. The Palestinians have failed to accept any offer ever given to them. Their people are wallowing in misery. Their economy has been stagnant or going south, going negative for decades. The rest of the world is passing them by. And this is your last chance to give peace a chance, because if you blow it this time, even the cheerleaders who were on your side in the past, they've moved on too. They're not waiting for you. The Saudis are not waiting for the Palestinians. The Emiratis are not waiting for the Palestinians. The Kuwaitis and the Omanis and the Bahrainis are not waiting for the Palestinians. So if you keep sitting on your hand and saying, no, well, bye-bye, well, we'll just say yes. and we'll come up with our own plan. And if you read the plan, it's like, oh, that's pretty cool. I mean, Israel's getting a lot of stuff. And when I was here last Friday, it was 3 days after the plan was unveiled, 2 days before Netanyahu was supposed to bring it to a cabinet meeting to approve the first step of annexation. A day or two after Ambassador David Friedman said, you can annex right now if you want. 3 days after you had the Omani, Bahraini, and Emirati ambassadors sitting in the White House, followed by some positive remarks by Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco. And here we are just a week later, and much of that has changed. Netanyahu's not taking this to any cabinet meeting, not just because he can't. Jared Kushner essentially put the kibosh on that. There was a diametrically different perspective from Ambassador Friedman and Jared Kushner, and it looks like the Kushner admonition will prevail, that this will not be brought to, there will be no annexation, no unilateral action by Israel until after the election on March 2nd. This has created a lot of what I would have thought would be very predictable tension within the Israeli right. I mean, I talked about Senator Warren getting a bit over her skis with some of her policies. I don't understand how Prime Minister Netanyahu decided to take the leadership of Yesha, Yehuda v'Shomron, the West, Judea and Samaria. These are very principled people, which is a nice way of calling them radical, nationalistic ideologues, on his plane, on his trip to the White House to be present when all this is unveiled. Bibi certainly knew what was in this plan. He wrote it or co-wrote it. And it allows for Israeli annexation. It's not very clear as to when it could happen. It could be read that it could be happen. It could certainly happen before the Palestinians do the things that they're supposed to do. So it's pretty one-sided in the sense that it enables Israel to take unilateral measures that aren't indexed to any Palestinian behavior. The Palestinians don't really get anything unless Israel approves of it. So it's really not a two-state solution, but more of a one-and-a-half-state solution. But Bibi, it does call for the Palestinians at some point to get a state. And, my brother is very religious. He and I were at a class at Aish Torah about 30 years ago in the Old City. And we were given a speech about the continuity of Judaism and how remarkable it is. You've got Jews from Iraq and Jews from Yemen and Jews from Eastern Europe and Western Europe and North Africa and South Africa and the Orient and the Occident, and you've had a Torah that's been written and transcribed by people who are accredited as a sofer, as a scribe, and they found hundreds of these Torahs around the world. And when you looked at all these Torahs written over centuries in all these remote communities, all of them together in the aggregate had a discrepancy of like 9 letters. Mind-boggling, right? You know what my brother said? Which 9 letters? What are the 9 letters? I gotta know. It's like that other joke where you get, but this thing actually happened. There's a story of a Far Side cartoon. You got these monks in the bowels of some monastery looking at the original theological scripture of Christianity, and it says celebrate, right? So you have these radical nationalists. Yes, Israel's going to annex whatever it wants, sort of, and Israel's going to get this and that, and the Palestinians aren't going to get anything. But if A, B, C, D, and all the way to Z and Z and other letters that haven't been invented yet happen, then they actually do get a Palestinian state with a part of East Jerusalem so far from anything that you can actually see in Jerusalem as the capital. No way! If he brought that to a government decision, which is why Gantz has threatened to bring the Trump peace proposal to a Knesset debate, but he doesn't, there's some tension about whether, that would be a brilliant move for blue and white, because it would force the right wing, the radical right that is supportive of this whole right-wing bloc, to say, yes, there is some concatenation of events in the future, as unlikely as that is, but maybe slightly more likely than a bunch of monkeys typing out Shakespeare on a typewriter where the Palestinians get a state. No way. They would never, ever, ever be able to vote to support that. And that puts the prime minister in a bind. And he's had a very uncomfortable week and a half. So contrary to the victory laps that people were predicting, he has, in addition to some of his other challenges, had to grapple with this. So what does the plan actually say? I'm going to talk about 5 different elements. So let's start with borders. So the borders don't look anything like the Green Line border. They do a little bit. I mean, Sharon, Prime Minister Sharon, erected this security barrier. Is it a wall? Is it a fence? It's both. It's a barrier. It's a separation barrier. That's what it is. And he was obsessed with maps. He had a map fetish, and he knew a lot. He wasn't a kid, and he'd spent a lot of time in the area in multiple capacities. And the barrier was able to capture the big settlement blocks. There are about 5 of them that constituted about 77% of the settler population. I'm not talking about Jerusalem. When I talk about settlers or inhabitants, I don't want to use politically noble, loaded terms. The inhabitants of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, living outside the Green Line, he was able to bring them in through the security barrier. And the idea, which I believed, is like, why in any potential future Palestinian state should there be this overriding assumption that there won't be a single Jew allowed to live there? That was always the Palestinian theory. Whatever we come up with, it's got to be Judenrein. I'm stealing a term that, obviously has its own historical connotations. So that always bothered me, and it bothered a lot of other people. And I think that this Trump initiative appropriately recognizes that you don't have to have a Palestinian state that's Judenrein. However, they drew the borders so that not a single settler is going to live under Palestinian sovereignty. So what they did is they did the same thing in reverse. They carved out these little areas. There are 62 of the 128 towns, settlements, or villages, whatever you want to call them. 62 of them are outside of the security barrier. They're obviously the much smaller ones, right? In terms of population, 77-23. So you'd have about 130,000 inhabitants on the other side of the barrier. That's approximately 12, 13, 14 times more than the 9,000 residents of Gaza when they had the Gaza evacuation in 2005. So it would be a tricky thing to do. So some of them were probably thinking that they'd get some compensation to leave. Others were ideologically, hell-bent on staying. But this map lets all of them stay and lets all of them stay under Israeli sovereignty. In addition, of these 62, there are 15 Israeli or Jewish settlements that are right smack in the middle of Arab towns, the Kiryat Arbas of the world. And that gets extremely complicated. You saw what a defense and security challenge that presented for the IDF during the period that these places were in Gaza. This compounds it by multiples. That having been said, Israel has not yet, asserted sovereignty over this. But if you're going to give anybody a hope of a state, it's got to have some sort of meaning. I'm not saying there should be a Palestinian state. Shouldn't be a Palestinian state. I think it was impossible under the way the world works before this Trump peace plan was proposed. But we have to understand why this was proposed, why it was proposed now, and what's in it. So from a border standpoint, these borders are really not tenable, which is why both Jared Kushner and Secretary of State Pompeo said, come up with another plan. You don't like this, give us a counteroffer. But it was a very real estate driven. Let's not forget where Trump and Kushner sort of come from. They come from, the world of New York real estate. It's real estate. You give somebody a low ball, make me a counteroffer, right? So the counteroffer is, I'm not doing anything. All right, well, you're getting another inch. That's not going to work. I don't know that it was intended to work, but it's not going to work. Jordan Valley. Everybody talks about the Jordan Valley. Israel now wants to go and annex the Jordan Valley. In every single construct, it's critical that Israel maintain control over the Jordan Valley. Jordan Valley is the border with Jordan, so Israel has to have a role in policing what happens along that border. Because if you get rid of that border, you've got Iraq, you've got Iran, so there's got to be a buffer that Israel has some say over. It doesn't need to have sovereignty. You don't need sovereignty over a little strip of land in order to have control over border crossings. So I think that historically, every initiative contemplated at least a long-term, if not a permanent presence of the Israeli security military establishment in the Jordan Valley. No other plan that has ever been proposed gave Israel nearly immediate sovereignty over that. Refugees, all right? So the Palestinian narrative was always driven by, we want the absolute right of return of all the Palestinians into the land of Israel. So, great, thank you for sharing that. That means you're not serious. There's no reason to have a second sentence, let alone the rest of this conversation. And that's been sort of what's been driving the left into the center. The reason why the left have come to the center more than any other reason is because of this refugee proposal. They don't go to Jerusalem and they don't know the difference between, the old city and Shuafat. But they do know that if you want to bring millions of Palestinian refugees, and the way people count refugees is just mind-blowing, that would essentially suffocate the demographic character of the state of Israel, and this document doesn't have any of that. There is no right of return. Even Israel in previous discussions offered to consider a limited return of some Palestinians into certain parts of Israel, like Ramla and Lod and Haifa, that are cities where they have families. Under this, there's no requirement for them to do that. Any answer to the Palestinian refugee challenge will be answered by whatever Palestinian state emerges. Yet Israel can control not only the number of Palestinian refugees that would be allowed into the Palestinian state, but it can also exclude specific refugees that it doesn't like. There are a lot of bad people out there, right? There really are a lot of bad people out there. There are killers who've been hiding in Morocco and Tunisia and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Kuwait. These are horrible people with blood on their hands who should be sitting in an Israeli prison, or worse if Israel had capital punishment. So I wouldn't want them anywhere in my country, but this is not going to be Israel's country. So Israel here too has a veto over which Palestinian refugees would have the right of return into a Palestinian state. That's a stretch. On security issues, right? Demilitarization, everything else. The Palestinians don't get anything until they reach certain criteria. They have to pass certain thresholds. And those thresholds include demilitarization of themselves, the demilitarization of Hamas, recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. That's a big one. For me, that's a big one. For me, that's always been a real good acid test. When I'm in a conversation with somebody, Palestinian or otherwise, do you believe that Israel ought to be recognized as a Jewish state? Give me one Magen David on Rothschild Boulevard. I'll talk to you about the borders later. If they say no, I don't really want to have a conversation, because then there's really not much to talk about. But the Palestinian narrative is very different. And that's why this whole thing of narratives, which is the fifth of the elements of the peace plan, is so critical. Because I read this the first time, and I said, all right, this is cute. It's obviously political. It's going to help Bibi in March. It's going to help Trump in November. The evangelicals will be all over it. It says all the right things about the critical issues of security and borders and refugees, and certainly Jerusalem. I mean, if I said, Abu Dis you may have heard of, because Birzeit University is in Abu Dis, but Shuafat is a refugee camp. You drive past it on your way to Ramallah. I've driven through it a couple times. I've never stopped. I never opened my window. It's a swamp. And that doesn't mean you can't make a swamp pretty. Other people have done it. Some swamps in Israel are now cities. And Kfar Aqba, which is another sort of thankless, all far away beyond the security barrier that we talked about earlier. So coming back to Kansas City, that could be Kansas City, Palestine, or Jerusalem, Palestine. But it is so far away from what their theological, nationalistic, ideological, territorial aspirations were for a peace or a share in Jerusalem. Again, it could be that low-ball offer. Come back and negotiate. You want another refugee camp? We can find one. You want another little town that's on the other side of the security barrier? Maybe we'll give that. We'll give that to you too. But it's clearly a signal that this is supposed to feed the electoral needs of two candidates that are relying heavily on constituencies that would love this document, with the exception of the radical right in Israel that would not accept any recognition of a Palestinian state, whatever would happen in the future. So, but there's some really good things that are discussed here. What I like about it is it finally stops this, cycle of violence, moral equivalence, as though there's, equal culpability on both sides. This kind of recognizes that you should not be paying money to families of suicide bombers, to jihadists, to martyrs. That kind of activity, what we call pay for slay, should not be rewarded. You should be held to standards that meet Western standards of human rights, rule of law, transparency, that don't exist anywhere else in the Arab world. I mean, Jared Kushner was being interviewed on Fareed Zakaria's CNN program, GPS, last week, and Fareed asked him, well, you're laying out on page 34 a bunch of criteria that no Arab country in the world can meet. Okay, so what? I mean, maybe that's why Israel was forced into, Israel didn't have a choice to pick its peace partners, right? So it couldn't go to Jordan and say, depose the king, come up with a democratically elected parliament that will like us and we'll do a peace deal. You do a deal with whoever the leader of the country is at the time, whether it's King Hussein in Egypt, in Jordan, or Sadat in Egypt. Israel tried to sort of create a fake Lebanese government in 1982 that would then recognize Israel, and the Jamal brothers were assassinated one after the other, and then Hezbollah was created. So Lebanon is a Syrian, now Iranian proxy. So it's not a serious address. We'll talk about that in the next class when we talk about Syria and Lebanon and all that stuff. So teaser for next week. But this week, what I'm happy about is that every future discussion about a potential reconciliation, accommodation, modification of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians now has this document that people will refer to. We're no longer prisoners of Oslo or other agreements that contemplated the release of terrorists as goodwill measures and other things that really compromised Israel's security. The thing that I don't like about this is that it will also be the basis of future discussions that people may want to rip up. Nancy Pelosi famously ripped up the State of the Union address on Tuesday. She didn't like being snubbed, and that's domestic politics. I'm not going to talk about that. But if you look at what a next president or next administration will do, if they want to be graphic, they'll say this is so toxic and radioactive because it has Trump's fingerprints on it that we need to be different. And we need to go back to some other perspective, at best, dating back to Ronald Reagan being an honest, impartial broker. At worst, trying to say, well, we're going to be the anti-Trump. And if they were pro-Israel and all of this, we're going to be anti-Israel and all of that. And, coming back to the joke about the fellow who went to the bullfights, there could be a new president in 2021. There will be a new president in 2025. It could be a Republican president. It could be Pence. It could be Nikki Haley. It could be Ron DeSantis. But it could also be 2025. It won't be Bernie Sanders, but it could be AOC, or it could be someone else, Michelle Obama. Who knows who it could be? I mean, I'm not speculating over what the candidates will look like in 2024. I'm having enough trouble getting my head around who's running in 2020. But the only thing we can all agree on is we don't know. And because we don't know, we celebrate too early at our peril. I had a conversation with an Israeli journalist who leans to the right, and she was delighted. She said, this is the greatest thing. Because finally somebody is opening the kimono and exposing the naked truth for what it is, and that the Palestinians have tried to have it always, and the more they rejected, the more people sort of kowtowed and said, well, if you didn't like that, well, you like this. Is like, I got a little 2.5-year-old kid, well, you don't like this blippy show, maybe we'll go to another show, and just stop crying. Here's another pacifier. It doesn't work in parenting, and it certainly doesn't work in peace. So what I anticipate is that the discrepancy between last week's unveiling and this week's analysis will continue to create challenges. The biggest thing, and I mentioned this last class, that folks were hoping for was momentum from the Arab world. And I think that because of electoral considerations, this baby was born too soon, right? We couldn't wait another year, we couldn't wait another 6 months. But the relationships, the important and real relationships that Israel is beginning to enjoy, but really just beginning to enjoy, with Abu Dhabi, with Riyadh, with Muscat, with Doha. These are the Prime Minister flew to Uganda and met with the President of Sudan. I mean, these are tough customers, but these are not natural allies of Israel. And it's certainly a stick in the eye to the Palestinians, but because there was so much enthusiasm and so much gloating following the release of this plan, it enabled the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation immediately to get back in step behind Abbas, who's been increasingly marginalized. And that's not good. And I think that that's the biggest challenge for people who are hoping for something along these lines to not just see the light of day, but get real attention and maybe have a tangible contribution to this process. Because things weren't so bad. Like, we didn't really need a peace plan that wasn't going to be implemented. It's very nice to have the President of the United States and his national security team and his State Department write something better than the Israelis themselves would dare write. But from a practical standpoint, Israel is doing very well. Israel looks like it will continue to do well, and I think it will continue to do well with or without this peace plan. But it creates as many challenges as it does opportunities. It embarrasses some nascent fellow travelers who are going to think twice and look behind their backs before doing anything overtly friendly. The relationships were obviously much friendlier behind closed doors than they were out in the open, even though these ambassadors did step into the White House briefing room when the peace plan was announced. So I'm looking at it like everybody else in this room is looking at it. I think that the elections in March will be super interesting. You've got right-wing allies of the Prime Minister camped outside of his residence, threatening that they're not going to vote for him unless he does some, meaningful annexing gesture. Bibi and his team are looking for some strip of land that they can annex before March 2nd without alienating the folks in the administration that told them not to dare to do anything until then. I mean, let's remember, this is a caretaker transitional government number 3. This does not fall under the Israeli sort of basket of things that caretaker governments do. But it's tricky, and it's super interesting. If it didn't matter so much, if the consequences weren't so meaningful, I'd say this would be great theater. But it's great theater anyway. And if you look closely at the players and their perspectives and all the different vectors impacting on who's doing what, who's saying what, and it's multidimensional. It's not the Israelis and the Palestinians anymore. It's not just the Democrats and the Republicans. It's not just the Americans, the Europeans. Boris Johnson is the most vocal pro-Trump peace plan cheerleader, but that has a lot to do with Brexit, right? I mean, he's feeling pretty isolated. He pushed. Now they're finally out of the European Union. Be careful what you wish for. So he's feeling pretty isolated, and they were hoping that the United States would be a surrogate for the trade relationships that they're losing with the rest of Europe. They'll make up for with the United States. So who knows how all these things are connected, but they certainly are. And I think it's fascinating, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
What's the question?
What's the difference between a socialist and a communist? And which one is Bernie? Look, these are political science terms. I'm not going to sort of give you my perspective. Look, communism is the ideology is that everything belongs to the people, right? It's a commune. Everybody shares in everything. Socialism historically means that there's one giant safety net to make sure that nobody falls through and that there's at least a basic income, depending on what the policies are. I mean, there are different policies associated with these ideologies. Whichever one Bernie is, a socialist or a communist, he's an ideologue, and he has a very different vision for America than most people do. And I think ultimately it's up to the Democratic. I'm not a member of either party, but it's up for the people in the Democratic Party to decide if that vision that at least to date has been so different than the pillars on which the American dream has been built, that whether that should be the standard bearer going into a national election against somebody who's not going to be bashful in exposing how different that is. Well, I think he's keeping the proceeds from his book sale.
That's
Yeah.
And he's got the millions.
Peace plan, the issue of majority Arab populations inside Israel that are to be transferred beyond the new borders. And they're not too crazy about it. And I don't know how that's going to get resolved.
Excellent point. I neglected to mention, yes, these questions about something called the triangle. There's a triangle just southeast of Haifa that comprises of several Arab towns. Jiljilia, Al-Fahim are probably the two biggest ones. Collectively, close to 200,000 people live there, 200,000 Arabs live there. Just so you know, the lower Western Galilee is close to 70% Arab Israelis. It's part of Israel. I mean, and this is a bit of an anomaly of the 48 war, where that was Haifa itself had a lot of Arabs, and Akko was an Arab city. Many of them fled. There was more people fled from the Galilee going north in Lebanon. A lot of the people who fled east fled into what's now the West Bank, which is why that population is as big as it is. So the idea was to mitigate demographic imbalances, that whatever Palestinian state might emerge, they would then get the privilege of inheriting 150, 160,000 cousins and brothers. This is something that I think the Prime Minister also wishes would not have seen the light of day so soon. He certainly hasn't commented on it since the plan was released. I think that he and Lieberman and others have always talked about what a wonderful idea that this would be, but it certainly plays into an accusation that Israel is not an equal country for its citizens. Now, again, you and I and maybe everybody in this room feels like there's a difference between an Israeli Jew and Israeli Arab, and that's why there was this loyalty oath proposed, and why there was this nation-state declaration that actually passed in 2015, which led to the elections I talked about last week. But it's a pretty nasty thing to put into a proposal, because you're essentially broadcasting that, we love all of our citizens, but how nice and convenient would it be if we could just take this little enclave that's so neatly packaged and geographically proximate to some place that might be the other and lump it in with the other. So certainly before an election, Netanyahu is not going to want to agitate an even greater Arab voter participation. But what you're asking about is what's called the Triangle. It's in the lower Western Galilee, and it comprises of about a dozen Arab villages that in the aggregate represent probably about 15 to 20% of the overall Arab population in the state of Israel. Yes?
Don't you agree that there's no point in discussing this peace plan with anybody until the Arabs accept Israel
So your question is a good one, but it doesn't matter because I don't have to agree with it, what you said. The document explicitly says that. So the good news for you is that, so A, without being cute, I do agree with that as certainly a very key litmus test. I hope I mentioned that. But the document is very specific for the very first time. It pushes that as a precondition of any of the entitlements that would accrue to the Palestinians under the deal. Yes.
In Canada, as you know, it also happened when Harper was Prime Minister and you had a majority of Jews voting for the Conservative Party. Do you think that there will be a sizable Jewish, never majority of course, but a sizable Jewish vote for Trump in that time?
I do. You know, it's an interesting question. The question, if you didn't hear it, was when Prime Minister Harper ran for re-election in Canada for the first time ever, you had, I mean, like in the United States, where historically Jews tend to vote for the Democratic Party. Some people here still think they're voting for FDR, but Canada did have this very vocal, visible expression of gratitude for Harper and his administration, especially regarding their policy on Israel. I do think so. You know, I think that Trump is anathema to many Americans. He's anathema to many American Jews, and certainly Jews who identify very closely with the Democratic Party and its core principles are not going to tell anybody. But it reminds me, for those of us who follow Israeli elections closely, Sharon was reviled. He was the butcher of Sabra and Shatila. Nobody ever thought after, he had this whole trial with Time magazine. He accused them of slander. He was the Minister of Defense, and the accusation was that he allowed the Christian Phalange to go into these refugee camps and massacre 1,000 people. He was rehabilitated when Bibi became Prime Minister in 1996 as the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure, but he was in the political wilderness for about 10 years. And then when Bibi lost to Ehud Barak, he was like this holdover caretaker leader. And in 2001, the last time you ever had direct elections for a prime minister in Israel, and he ran against Ehud Barak, he destroyed Barak. He didn't win. Nobody thought he would win because nobody would admit to tell a pollster, yeah, I'm going to vote for the butcher of Sabra and Shatila. He got 68% of the vote, or some overwhelming margin. I voted for him. But I was living in Israel at the time because it just seemed like he said the right things. He ran a good campaign. He had a clear game plan for what he wanted to accomplish. And, it's called like Hamachteret shel Sharon, like the underground of Sharon, like people who wouldn't talk about it vote for him. I think you're going to see a lot of that for Trump also. I think that, Trump is on so many levels a difficult person to admire. And I think that nobody would want to tell a pollster or even their own spouse or even look in the mirror and say, I will vote for this guy. But I think that there are going to be a lot of people who are going to just take an accounting. And if they decide to participate in the voting process and they go to the booth and they see that name on the top of a ticket and they think about, recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, unwinding the Iran deal, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, conditioning aid to the Palestinians on good behavior, cutting it off when that good behavior hasn't demonstrated itself. I think that is going to express itself. The big difference, like in Canada, the Jewish population here is shrinking, and certainly shrinking as a percentage of voter participation. The Jewish participation in elections in this country, and increasingly in Canada, is money. So you're going to see, and you are already seeing, a lot of large Jewish donors to the Republican Party, not just to Trump, but to folks running in different parts of the country, because they feel that these are positive developments. I will tell you though, as a caveat, I answered your question, but I think that what troubles me a little bit is that in such a an eager attempt to gain more sovereignty through this annexation, Israel, I won't say it's compromising its sovereignty, but for the first time since I've been politically sentient, the older I get, the longer that is, Israel is sharing its sovereignty a little bit with the United States. Israel famously, bucked the United States, did things the United States didn't like. We talked about the Lebanese invasion. Even a year earlier, you had the bombing of the Osirak reactor. It was condemned by Reagan, but we felt we had to do it. We did it. We're Israel. We want to be friends with the United States. We recognize that you're then one of two superpowers, now really the only superpower left on the planet. Today, Israel can't really do anything that dramatic or that drastic without a green light from the U.S. So if Bibi wanted to annex, Kushner says no, it's no. And it doesn't matter how many people protest outside his house and how many people tell him they're not going to vote for him. This intimate affection with the president and the prime minister has actually had a hamstringing effect. Those two congresswomen, Rashid Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, Ron Dermer, who doesn't go to the bathroom without the prime minister's permission, told the visiting delegation, the largest delegation, over 40 members of the House of Representatives, Democrats, that yes, if they come to Israel, they will be welcome here. Trump sort of ridiculed the prime minister and said, I think it's a bad idea to let him in. They weren't let in. So there's a flip side to how close that relationship has become. And I think that we've seen a few, and I think we're likely to see more instances where Israel's freedom to act is going to be circumscribed by signals that it's getting from the White House. We're going to talk about how Russia's involved in all of that when Syria in the next class. Yes?
That was my question. The dynamic is shifting because those relations with Russia has grown more and more friendly.
Well, it's grown more friendly by necessity. Yeah, it's grown more friendly by necessity. Israel can't even fly its planes over Syria anymore without telling the Russians first where they're going.
Right, and it's all very complicated by Russia's friendship with Iran and Syria.
Are you going to be here next week? Thank you for that teaser. Yes, one last question.
Do you think the Democratic Party is becoming anti-Israel?
No. I think that's important. Do I think the Democratic Party is becoming anti-Israel? No. And this is important because this is the class dedicated. I'll talk about this on March 6th, the last class. I may learn things at APAC and hear things that'll make me change my mind. Look, it's very seductive to be in a room with Republican politicians or go to a church and listen to evangelicals speak about Israel in terms that would would make the most ardent Zionists feel like they gotta, brush up on their Zionism. So it's hard to deny that it looks like there is clearly one party that's unabashedly, unequivocally pro-Israel, and another party that isn't, okay? So the Democratic Party is not unabashedly, not wholeheartedly, not unequivocally pro-Israel, but if you look at the core of the Democratic Party, and I think this is so important to emphasize because the bipartisan nature of the relationship, I don't need to refer to the bullfight 3 times in the same lecture, but it's so critical to encourage the majority of the Democratic Party, and still clearly a leading majority of the Democratic Party, that run for elections, win elections, sit in state legislatures, sit in DC, and make decisions that have a huge impact on our community and on the state of Israel. They are, for the most part, with clear, vociferous, visible exceptions, pro-Israel. And it's very much in our interest that it stay that way. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.